Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Network Environmental Performance Reporting technical webinar. My name's Bella Whittle and I am joined by my colleagues Eddie Winter, who's a Senior Policy Advisor, and Eddie will be running you through the details about the template and giving you some tutorial around how to fill it in, helping with any questions. We've also got Ed Young. He's a Senior Technical Advisor who is very experienced with some of the more technical aspects of drinking water, asset management and the like, so should be able to answer any questions around any particularly technical questions. But before we get into our content for today, I'd like to kick us off with a karakia and a whakatoaki. Kia horo te marino, kia whakapapa pōnamu te moana. He huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai. Tātoi a tātou katoa. Haumie, huie, taikie. So this karakia that we've chosen is an apt way to kick off this kaupapa. It talks about the elements as a way of ensuring calmness, clear direction, and having mutual respect for each other as we learn, discuss, and come together. Thanks. So we'll move on to, this is the whakatoaki, taumataarowai. Ko te wai aho, ko aho te wai. He whakaturanga tātou no te wai. Ko te ora te wai, ko te ora o te tangata. He taonga te wai me te aki. Ko wai tātou, ko wai tātou. This whakatoaki speaks to the core kaupapa of taumataarowai, of why and how it is a treasure that we look after and reflects in the health of people. We'll move on to what we'll cover today. So this is quite a technical webinar. We'll be getting into the ins and outs of the reporting template. Perhaps some of you, hopefully a reasonable number of you, will have attended an earlier webinar where we, Eddie will have given some higher level context around what the purpose of the reporting is and some of the changes this year, but we're planning to dive straight into the kind of ins and outs of the actual reporting template, and I'll cover some of the comment fields and what if obviously there's quite a lot of numbers that you need to report, but also if you have some additional commentary around what happened this year, we'd be interested in that. Finally, we'll just touch on what support and guidance there might be, and then we can answer any pārtai that you might have at the end. So I will hand over to Eddie to go into the template.
Sure. Thank you for that, Bella. So we're talking about the measures reporting for the period 23-24. Those measures are due to us by the 30th of September 24, so a couple of months from now. All the data that we receive, we analyse and we'll publish into our annual report, the National Network Environmental Performance Report. And the reason we do this is to provide transparency and to help drive improvements across the water sector across Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this applies to all public drinking water and wastewater networks. Obviously, we're introducing wastewater network measures for this year. So what do we mean by public? These are networks which are operated by councils, council-controlled organisations, government departments, and the New Zealand Defence Force. So this year we're introducing the first suite of wastewater measures. So these are what we call the static measures as of 1 July. So these tend to be more asset-based rather than ongoing performance-based measures. So some of those continuous measures we'll be looking to capture this time next year. So it's good to put practices and processes in place to capture those measures. It's part of an ongoing program where we'll be looking at drinking water, wastewater, and potentially in the future, stormwater measures. So all of these measures and their definitions can be found in the guide, which is available on our website. There's also a summary of these measures, which is available on our website. Next slide, please. So what's required and when? So by 30th September, we are going to talk a little about this later. There were a number of extensions last year where people provided information after that deadline. This year, the deadline is the deadline. Data which is not provided by that date will not be included in the report. So 30th September is a hard deadline. So the process is download the spreadsheet or the template, which is available on our website. The guide's also there on the website. And if you've done this last year, as part of the 22-23 data submission, some of the data which you provided last year is going to be similar. So a useful way to speed up the process for you is to take last year's spreadsheet, look at this year's spreadsheet, and some of the information will be similar. So it gives you a starter for 10. We always recommend that whatever data you've provided has gone through an appropriate sign-off process, because the information you provide us, we will report. And so this is the information being reported publicly on behalf of your organisation. So if you need to get sign-off, it's good to consider that. Please only provide one template to us. So this year we've only got one spreadsheet for all the measures, but please only provide one consolidated copy for your organisation. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So once you've got all the information, you put it into the spreadsheet, email it to us at measures@taumataarowai.govt.nz. I'll repeat that email address a few times, because if there's any questions, you can contact us at that address at any point. So once you've sent it to us, you'll get a confirmation that either says, thanks, we've received your data, or thanks, but we seem to have some questions, or there may be some issues with the data you've submitted. So that'll give you some indication that the data has been received. Last year, we came back to a number of operators and we asked some questions where some of the data appeared to be outside of the expected range. We may do this again this year to go back and have an opportunity to have a discussion to verify some of that data where it appears to be outside of that range. And again, to reiterate the points, 30th September is a hard deadline and we will not be giving extensions this year. So what does the template look like? It's available on the website. Some of you I see have already downloaded it, which is great. So there's one template this year and it's got a number of sheets going across the Excel spreadsheet. So the first page, very easy, is contact details. The next are split down into either drinking water or wastewater, and a lot of those sheets will look very, very similar. We'll look at those later. So starting off at a high level for the whole of the organisation, there are some measures across the whole of the council's district or across the whole of a department for the country. But you may have a number of different networks. So we drill down to the next level of network detail. Last year, there was a bit of a problem, and a lot of the changes we've made to the spreadsheet this year have been based on your feedback, lessons learned. So we said, okay, it was a little bit tricky last year to try and put all your resource consent details into one small cell. So we've put a number of rows for you to put individual detail against those. Likewise for abstraction points. And again, for wastewater, organisation level, network level, and resource consent level. So we've broken it down into more sheets in a more logical, structured manner this year. So let's have a look at some of those. First page, very easy, contact details. This is essentially for you to provide who you are, and so we have contact details. Obviously, contact details and email addresses are purely for our internal reporting purposes, and we will not publish this, but all the rest of the information will be reported. So we've structured the spreadsheet so there are a number of fields where you're required to provide information. Basically anything on the green cell, we're asking for information. The rest of the page is locked down just to protect the integrity of the spreadsheet, because once we receive the spreadsheet into our system, it automatically gets uploaded into our database. We want that to be a seamless process, so we've protected the rest of the document. So the first thing there, organisation, we've used lots and lots of drop-down lists to make life easy for everyone. So rather than typing your name in, I am Wellington Water Limited, if you click on the little drop-down arrow there, type W, it'll drop straight down to the list to Wellington or Whitehill or wherever. So by doing that, that will then auto-populate your account ID, so you don't have to go and look this up. This is the account ID you would have used in Hinakorako. And the next two fields there are self-explanatory. What was the date and your contact details. The blue box at the bottom there, and you'll see these on a few of the sheets as we go through, just gives a little bit of a running tab of how much data you've completed. So this is a blank sheet, there's nothing there. As you go through, it'll self-populate to just give you an idea of the percentage of the form which you've completed. So if we look at the next page there, which is the organizations level, there's lots of information on there, so I'll just break it down. The first few columns are looking exactly the same as the measures guide, which talks about what are the outcomes, the measures, the reference code. So when you search for something, you can find the reference code and what's the actual thing we're measuring. So that is just a copy and paste straight from the guide. A lot of these have got little red triangles in the top corner there. So I've copied a lot of the text from the guide into the spreadsheet this year. So if you hover over that cell that says, well, what exactly do I mean by the number of pump stations? Definitions are always very important. So the definition of the number of pump stations used to deliver treated water, that definition is there on all those cells that have got that little red triangle in the top corner. Next column over, really important to use the right units. Different people use different units, but we need to be consistent. So we've included the units there, and we've also included when you enter the data. So for instance, for that one there, which is measured in cubic meters per year, when you actually enter the data in there, you don't have to enter the units. The units are automatically populated for you. So if it's in cubic meters per year, it'll say 123 cubic meters per year. So that's just to reiterate the use of the right units. So things like pressure, we always use kPa. It's the standard SI unit rather than bars or meters of water, which are other units, but we've tried wherever possible to keep the units consistent with what's most commonly used across the industry. We've also included some examples and some expected ranges. So first question there, how many drinking water networks do you have? You've probably got somewhere between 1 and 10. That's just an expected norm. If you tell me you've got 1,000, that may just be a typo. So we've actually put some limits around things here to try and prevent people entering incorrect data where you've either got the wrong units or there's been a typo. So we've given you an expected range, and if it's wildly outside of that expected range, you may actually come up with an error message. Likewise, for the drop-down menus, if we look at the data confidence, there's a little drop-down arrow there. If you click on the drop-down arrow, you can pick from one of those. It's not a free text, so you can't just type something else in there. It has to be select from one of those predetermined choices. There's also an option there to add comments if you want to explain something, and there's an opportunity on each page to add more comments. This is particularly useful if you've got any best practices, any extenuating circumstances such as natural disasters which have impacted your operation for that period, or if you're saying, I haven't provided data this year but I should be able to provide this in future years. So that's an opportunity to give us a little bit more of a kind of a context around the measures and where there may be some relevant data sitting behind that. We've taken a bit of a lessons learned from Water New Zealand, who used to run a similar program, and they added 2 extra columns there, which are entirely optional. So the grey columns there allows you an opportunity, if you've got a lot of people across your organization who are providing different bits of data, you can tag people and say, okay, this information needs to come from this person and this is where it's sourced. So that's purely for your own internal data management purposes. So you can tag people and see where the data's come from. We're just looking at the green cells there. Those grey columns there are purely for your own use. If you find that useful, entirely optional. So that's at an organization level. The next slide talks about the network level. You may only have one network, in which case this is really easy. You just include one row. But if you've got 3 networks, in this example here, you've already told me on the previous slide there are 3 networks. So that first blue cell there is populated with 3. We would expect to see 3 lines of data. So for each network, you need to put some data in. And again, I haven't included all of the columns here. There are a number of different measures for each one of those networks. There are some number figures, which just type in a number. There are some select from, again, using the drop-down menu. And there are some select from for confidence levels. So to try and make things as user-friendly as possible, we've got a mixture of numbers drop downs. Yes, no is just a click on the select and it's a yes or a no. And again, units are included there for reference and they're pre-formatted to include that data there. So we've changed the resource consent on the next slide to give us a little bit more detail about your resource consent. So there are not a lot of pieces of information which we're requiring here, but it's just an easier way. We talked to people and said, wouldn't it just be easy to just give us one row for each one of our resource consents? So you look at the reference number, what type of resource consent is it? And again, that's a pick list. What's the expiry date? To make life easy for everyone, we've taken the standard English. So the 1st of December 2025 is 1/12/25. All the dates are formatted like that. And again, there's an option there to include any comments, or please provide some comments to provide extenuating circumstances, just to explain if there may be, well, the consent has expired, but we're operating on section 124 and this is pending review and we expect to see this in the next year. So give a little bit of context if there are any extenuating circumstances about resource consents. And the one other thing we're asking for detail about on the next slide is abstraction points. Again, one row per abstraction point, what's it called, and the flow rate. So there's an instantaneous flow rate that the resource consent allows you to take, liters per second, cubic meters per day, and cubic meters per year. So pretty much following the same format for those. So that's drinking water. We'll now move on to wastewater. Essentially, it follows the same format. So we've got the measures and we were looking for a result, a comment where applicable, and a data confidence. And we've also included those optional fields at the end there for you to tag who's providing the information, where that's kept. Moving down to the network level, again, for every one of your wastewater networks, provide some information about the network and some of those performance measures. Just talk a little bit about that point. I know we've had a few people who've asked, what is a network? I've got this network for this town here, and I've got a network for this town here, and they come together at this wastewater treatment plant. Do I count them as separate networks, or are they one? The approach we're taking for this is, in this particular instance, that would be a broad network where they're coming together to a single wastewater treatment plant, which has a single outlet. That's one network. If you've got two completely separate networks with their own wastewater treatment plants and their own discharge points, that would be seen as two. But if you come in together and you would have a resource consent for that plant and that plant's discharge, we would count that as a whole combined network. And talking of those resource consents on the next slide, we ask similar questions about your resource consents. So one line, one row for each of those resource consents, provide a little bit of detail about what the reference number that the regional council provided, what type of resource consent is it? Is it discharged to land? Is it discharged to air or water? Using the pick list here. When did it expire? What's the status of it? And the data confidence and the comments. So again, following a similar pattern, but just giving a bit of a breakdown and detail for those particular measures. So that's very, very quickly looking at the spreadsheet. As I say, we try to break it down logically into a few different sheets, but a lot of the same rules and tips and tricks that you would use on the first one, you'd use throughout. So for each one of those, fill each spreadsheet in, save, move to the next one, and the next one. Once you've combined all of that together, I think we'll look at the next slide. And I'm going to hand back over to Bella to talk a little bit about some of the best practices.
Sure, thanks, Eddie. Yeah, I guess this is really just to say, and Eddie has touched on it a few times in his run through, that while our focus is on collecting the numerical information that's required under the measures reporting, we are interested to hear about your comments, if there are any, about what sort of happened, if there are any best practices that we might want to look at, or on the other side of the coin, if there are any particular challenges, risks, or issues you faced, either at an individual level or you experienced due to a system, more of a kind of broader system-wide situation. So, the reason I raise this is because there is an opportunity in our reporting, in our annual reporting at the end of the year, to kind of highlight, particular situations that like a natural disaster, or examples of things that were innovative or being done well. So yeah, just that opportunity to, you could either use comments or you could even get in touch via the Measures email address, which is provided on the page there. So hand back to Eddie now. I think you've got a bit more content, haven't you, Eddie?
Yeah, thanks for that, Bella. So I understand that I've gone through that quite quickly. We just wanted to give people a broad overview of the template, how to fill it in, but there is more support and guidance available on the website, and there's more to follow. Throughout this presentation, if you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat function, and we'll deal with those questions probably at the end. We thought we'd run through the presentation, and then there's an opportunity at the end for your individual questions. And don't be afraid to put any questions in there. If you're thinking it, someone else is probably thinking it. So all questions are good questions. So other than today's webinar, we've got some other resources available. So the actual measures guidance document is available on the website. That's the Network Environmental Measures Guide 2024. There's a summary of those. If you don't want to read the full guide, there's a summary, but essentially the template takes all of the guide, all of the that information, and puts it into the template. But it's useful to have as a standalone Word document as well. That web page there for Network Environmental Performance Measures includes all of that data. And as we said before, if you've got any questions at all throughout this process, please feel free to get in touch with us through measures@taumataarowai.govt.nz. What's next? So we've got webinars today and tomorrow. These are run today and tomorrow simultaneously, just if there's opportunities for different people to come to those webinars. But we're also running a series of drop-in webinars throughout August and September. So from now until the end of that reporting period, 30th of September, you can contact us at any point via that email address, or feel free to come along to those webinars. We haven't put a structured presentation together for those webinars yet, but probably what we'll do is, if we start seeing a number of frequently asked questions, we might start pulling those together into an FAQ. There's an opportunity. They're half-hour sessions every 2 weeks throughout the rest of August and September. So again, feel free to pop any of those questions to us, or come along to those webinars. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the questions we've already had from some people, or some of the key issues for data reporting. So if you don't have any data, or if it's not applicable, please leave the cell blank. Excel does this strange thing that if you put in a 0, it reads it as a 0 value. If it's not applicable, don't put anything in there. If you put a 0 in there, when we do the statistical analysis, all those zeros get counted, so it kind of skews the analysis unduly. So if there is no data, please don't put any data in there. I mentioned before that we've given you examples and expected ranges. So if you told us that we've got 100 kilometers of pipe, that's a typical network. If you said you've got 100,000 kilometers of pipe, I'm going to ask, did you say kilometers or meters? So there's a little bit of a verification at the first step that says, if you've provided a number which is 100,000 kilometers, is just way outside of it, you may get an error message that says, are you sure you meant that? Double check your units, double check the number. It could be a typo. It's easily done. So that should deal with 9 out of 10 of those issues. But if you really, really do have a problem with this, please pop it in the comments field or get in touch with us and we'll do that. And likewise for the selection range. If we've given you a selection, you can't type other and add your own in there. It's got to be one of those from the pick list there. So all of the data, excluding personal details, will be analysed and put into the report, and then we also look to publish the raw data to sit behind that on the website. What if you don't have data, or you don't provide any data? As Bella talked to at the beginning, it is a legal requirement to provide this data, and we're asking you to provide the best data that you can practically source. So give me your best shot. For some of these measures, particularly where organisations are new to the reporting or they're struggling to provide data, you may be struggling and saying, look, we don't have this data. I would say, please provide a best guesstimate rather than just leave a blank, because a blank is just going to look obvious when we provide the report and the data. So if you've got a best guesstimate, even with a low confidence, it's better to provide something than nothing. And it is a legal requirement to provide this data. So just to reiterate that point, please give us as much data as you possibly can, but only in one spreadsheet. So the way our system works is if you send a template to us, a filled in spreadsheet, the data comes in to that measures inbox and it's automatically uploaded to our database. And all the information is ingested into the database for analysis. If you send a second spreadsheet in, and that could be because you've said, oops, I need to change a number, that's okay. We just accept the second or the third version that you send in. So every time a spreadsheet comes in from your organization, it gets uploaded. However, if somebody else in your organization sends in a different spreadsheet, it will only ever look at the last one. So the problem there being we can't combine the data together. We can only take the latest data. So if you've got an organization, please provide an organization-wide spreadsheet so there's only ever the one version that's ingested. Macros, we don't use macros. We avoid them like the plague because we know they're fraught with viruses. So we have not used any macros, just to confirm that to you. We've got a couple more FAQs. No. So that's, again, just looking at some of the issues we've seen before with the spreadsheet and some of the questions we've seen. But I see there are a few questions in the chat. So we're now going to have a quick look at those. I'm going to open the forum open for anyone else to drop things into the chat. And we'll look at the questions one at a time, and either myself, Ed, or Bella can probably answer those. So just give us a moment. We'll have a look through some of these questions and we'll answer them in order, starting from the top. So we've got one here asking, just to clarify, drinking water networks. If a water supply has 3 zones registered in Hinakaraka, does this constitute one network for the purposes of this report? Ed, feel free to jump in on this one. What's the difference between a zone and a network?
So we might have distribution zones set up to monitor flow rates. And if they are registered in Hinakaraka as a separate zone, then it would probably be better to register it as a separate network. Usually when we quantify a network, there's a source and then the distribution. So if your zone has its own source in it, then yeah, it can be considered its own little network. But if it doesn't, then we usually classify that one source going to that network as just one network.
Okay, thank you for that. And we'll probably take a lot of these questions from today's session, we'll anonymize them, we'll add them to the FAQs, which will be available so people outside of this forum can learn from these discussions. Couple of other technical questions here. The next one there, talking about the ratio of peak flow to normal flow. I believe this is the wastewater measure. So if the network is pumped, then the ratio may be 1 as the pump speed is unchanged. And previously we've measured this as peak daily flow. Okay.
So this measure is really trying to figure out if during a wet weather event or like a rain event, if there's a higher flow rate to your wastewater treatment plant or the pump stations are going higher. A lot of pump stations have variable speed drives on their pumps, so they may actually pump higher than normal when it's a higher flow rate or a higher inlet into the pump station. So that's why we had the peak versus nominal. If you want to do peak daily flow, that's fine. So if you had a peak daily flow and then the normal daily flow, that's a good ratio to use too. It is really just to see what the swing is.
Yeah, and it is about that normal versus what kind of headroom have you got to deal with that extra capacity or sort of extra flow, let's say, particularly during storms and high weather.
Yeah, and there's also the daily swing between when there's high flow, when the network's being used heavily during the morning or the afternoon, and the normal time. So it's just trying to figure that out.
Looking at those highs and lows, what kind of resource and capacity and headroom have you got above those sort of peaks and troughs. We should have said at the beginning, we are recording this webinar. We will publish either today or tomorrow's webinar. We'll publish these on the website along with the slides, and they'll be available fairly soon. Looking at the next question there about low pressure pump stations. I presume individual low pressure pump stations are not included in the pump station measure for wastewater. So I know one of the distinctions we have with pump stations is not the pump stations within the wastewater plant itself, because that's considered part of the operation of the plant. But if you're looking at pump stations upstream or downstream
in the network,
yeah,
we just want all the pump stations in the network. It's just counting them all.
Yeah. Okay, population estimates. I think there are questions. We've had this question before about population estimates. There are a few different methods for calculating population. I know Hinakarako has some guidance on how to calculate or estimate your population. Obviously, there are mesh blocks and there are a few other methods there. So there are some measures for drinking water networks which looks at ways to estimate the population. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that, Ed? Again, we're just looking for a consistent approach between them.
Like you can use different methods to measure the population as long as you do it the same across your entire network. It should be fine. Like I know that some people use stats.nz to get an idea of how much their population is for a distribution zone, but it's a little bit difficult because they don't really line up all the time. But yeah, you can. There is some guidance on our website about that, I believe, under drinking water. So
yeah, I think the point, the question there was asking more about mesh blocks. Mesh blocks work well for urban settings, but for rural areas it's a little bit harder because of mesh blocks.
They're huge blocks.
It's so big with such a small population density, but we're looking across a network. So if you've given us a number of population service in Hinakarako, take the same number for your drinking water supply for this. And likewise for wastewater, we would assume it's roughly 1-to-1. If you're supplying drinking water and you're supplying wastewater services, it would essentially be the same population size for that network, unless you've got overlapping networks. Emergency response. This is an interesting one. This is a new one for a few of these. So talking about the emergency response, would an actual emergency response be considered an exercise for the purpose of this measure? So we have a couple of questions about emergency responses. We say, do you have an emergency response preparedness plan? When was the last time it was reviewed, and when was the last time it was tested? So testing could be a bit like a fire drill. If you have a emergency response exercise, that's a test. Or if you had an actual emergency, that's also testing your emergency preparedness plan. Looking at distribution zones. So if a distribution zone is fed from a reservoir, does that count as the zone having its own source? This possibly talks to your question earlier, Ed.
Yeah.
Is that zone now a network?
No. The sources means like a bore, surface water, surface gallery, not a reservoir. So when I say source, it means like an actual source from nature.
Okay, so question here, what if I have more than 100 wastewater pump stations, as we've now included them in there? So, what if we have more than 100 wastewater pump stations, as we've now included low pressure pump stations? The spreadsheet went, so when I said 100, sorry, apologies. I think my example I gave before was how many wastewater networks have you got? Would probably be between 1 and 10 or 20. We wouldn't expect you to be operating 100 wastewater networks, but each one of those networks may have any number of different pumps as part of that. And they're either positive pressure pumps or they're vacuum pumps. We do ask to differentiate between them. So yeah, hopefully I answered that. So for each one of those measures, there's a little bit of a kind of a validation range, and it should be appropriate for the particular measure there. There's another question there. So the 2023 census data, which is very useful for mesh data, is not being released until October 24. That's unfortunate. As we know, the last census fell in the middle of COVID lockdown, so that has to be pushed out. So a lot of the data, which is useful for a lot of organisations, unfortunately isn't going to be available, that census data, until later. But again, if we're talking about mesh block data and population size, we would expect you to be using the same tools to calculate your drinking water population or your wastewater population as you've probably already done within Hinakaraka.
For population, I would probably suggest using whatever value you put into Hinakaraka if it's still up to date. Because that Hinakaraka is our one true source of data for all the information we have. Yep. So it should match.
Okay. We've got one question here, which again is just talking about that 100 pump stations. It looks like you do have a very high number of pump stations. If you do have a particular problem that you can't put data into that cell because for whatever reason it's not letting you, get in touch with us. So the person that sent this question, I'll have a chat with you after this and we'll see if we'll talk about that. We'll see if there's a way around to resolve that.
Also, if you do hit any problems, and it might be crunch time, just write it into the comments. We will read them, and if there is some issue that, say, like you have 1,000 pump stations and it can only allow you to write 100, or if you have 20 wastewater treatment plants and it only allows you to enter 10, just write a comment in there and we'll address it.
Yeah. So we'll take all of these Q&As from the chat. We'll add them to our sort of growing list of FAQs, and once they've kind of been anonymized and cleaned up with the questions and the answers, we'll look at a way of publishing those so other people can learn from these experiences. But again, if you do have any other specific questions, we can have a conversation offline as well. So we've come to the end of the questions at the moment. There's still a little bit of time left in the presentation. If people do have any further questions, feel free to speak now or get in touch with us later. So there's always the option to sort of follow up if you've got any other questions. We'll give people just a couple of minutes. If there's anything you would like us to go back over, we can go back to a previous slide and we can talk through something if you'd like us to please explain something in particular. Or we'll just give people a couple of minutes if you do have any other sort of questions. There's a last chance here, or as I say, you can flick them through to us at any time after today's presentation.
There is another comment I want to make about populations. I know some places have a seasonal change in populations. Just write the maximum population, because the minimum is, and then put a note in there into the comments saying, usually this is the biggest population we have under normal under seasonal conditions, either summer or winter, and then you can put your other population down into the comments. So don't enter both of them into the cells.
Yeah, you can only put one number, use the peak number. And the reason we use peak is obviously it allows us to sort of, and you to understand the peak capacity and availability. Alrighty, going once, going twice. If we've got no more questions, I'll hand back to Bella to close us out.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Ed. And thanks for all your great questions, participants. So I'm going to close us off with a karakia. Unohia, unohia, unohia ki te uro tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te ngako, te tinana, te wairoa I te ara takatu. Koia rā e rongo whakairia, ake ki runga, kia tina, hui e, taikie.